Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of Policy War, the show where progressive, libertarian, and conservative discuss political issues in the United States. I am one of your co hosts, Russell. Our conservative couldn't make the day, but we do have our middle of the road individual here.
Yep, that's me. I'm Matt. I'm middle of the road with a little bit of a libertarian slant.
I understand why you don't want to associate yourself with the libertarians of America, even though, you know, it's really classical liberalism from Adam Smith, but it's understandable, they're libertarians in America. I mean, at least the party or people who are at the national conference are, don't seem like the most normal people. So I understand your unwillingness to just call yourself libertarian.
There's different shades. There's
I'm
different shades of stuff. I mean, you probably wouldn't want to identify with the far, 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 left, and John probably wouldn't want to, be standing with the far, far, far right.
Of
So
course, I
you just gotta
dislike.
call it as you see it.
Yeah, I dislike Lenin. I dislike Zedong. I'm not that far left, right. I don't want to.
You didn't disown
Oh,
Stalin.
I mean, Stalin had no political philosophy but his own power. Okay. Um. So 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 what we're going to talk about today is Biden being the president. No matter how much Trump whines about it, Biden is the president elect, and he has announced what he's going to do during his first day in office. So, with that comes a flurry of executive proposals he hopes to enact. And this was done with a talk on Fox News on Monday, in which he said he basically hopes to reverse a lot of Trump's initiatives that he had stated during his time as president. One of the first things he plans to do is to rejoin the Paris Climate Change Accords. So that basically, for people that don't know, was non-binding agreements signed by countries all over the world to basically reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and slowly convert to renewable energy. Trump pulled out of that agreement. The United States is pretty much the only developed country to not be a part of that agreement. And it shows how Trump is basically in bed with the fossil fuel lobby. So what do you think, Matthew, about this being one of the first thing he does during his 4 years in office? One of the first things he planned to do is to rejoin Paris Climate Change Accords.
Well, I think it speaks magnitudes about the nation's direction. Of course, at least acknowledging that climate change is playing a significant role and returning to the helm of the leadership position it held earlier before we backed out and essentially allowed China to take that helm and take our place in a sense. So it's always good to retake those positions. However, he probably will have some opposition from conservatives and likely some opposition from states where, oil and drilling is a significant part of their job and their economy. So it's going to be a delicate balance, but I think it's a good start.
I
Uh,
mean,
Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, it's true that states that rely on oil and a minority of fracking for jobs are not going to be happy about this. But of course, renewable energy is, the energy source of the future. I mean, solar looks pretty, what's the word, lucrative to stock market, a lot of companies out there. And also, oil isn't infinite. Oil eventually runs out. And along with that, you just accelerate the climate change crisis that many climatologists are saying, once we hit 2050, once we hit this many parts per billion, the world's over. The world isn't over, of course. There'll just be more floods, more hurricanes, more droughts as the climate of the earth increases. So while I don't think it's a world ending event, I think it's important that, he does decide to do this his first day in office, and it shows that coronavirus isn't the only crisis that we should deal with. I think a problem during this pandemic is that, yes, coronavirus is obviously one of the, if not the most important thing once it started, but we can't just neglect everything else. We can't just neglect how the earth will look like in 20 to 30 years, So I'm glad he's making this one of his top initiatives, but it also seems like we're just going to be in a cycle of Biden reversing everything Trump did, and then whatever Republican wins the next election, just reversing everything Biden did, instead of just a constant line towards progress that the nation should be taking. Rather, it's just this bumpy road of progress as America tries to catch up to European nations, who have much higher quality of life. So what do you think about this cycle of reversing that keeps happening in administrations, and also, you know, his focus on still pushing forward renewable energy?
Well, I think that, it's something natural that's going to happen in a democracy like the United States, where you don't have those third parties or those coalitions that really form. You look at the United Kingdom or other parliamentary systems, you see coalitions form. So there's never really much of a majority. There's always this kind of, uh, should I say, like gray area that appears, that a gray area in policy where these parties can come together and at least find something. They may be opposite ends of the aisles, but they can find something to, form a coalition and then move forward. Of course, you have some falling out between those coalitions later on, but it kind of brings a new dynamic. Whereas, here in the United States, it's essentially party line. That's the way it's
Mm.
become. You look at impeachment, you look at the Supreme Court vote, you have, one or two that may go against, but for the most part, it's majority down the line. So there's just not as much of it. Now, I do think that's a problem, and it's something that I will admit I'm not too knowledgeable on solving. I mean, anyone could
I
propose
mean,
anything, but
it is a pretty large issue. I mean, in all honesty, it's systemic of American political governance. So, I mean, there definitely isn't one easy solution on how to solve it. I do wish we could come to a time of more consensus during these times. One of his other proposals that Biden wants to pass is a national mask mandate, in which he basically forces everybody to wear masks, especially on transportation. He made sure to enunciate, and this is not enforced in the U.S. as it is enforced in other nations like Japan, China, Sweden, not as much. Finland, um, Italy, Germany, all these nations have some form of mass mandates, while America basically made it decentralized, very state by state. For some reason, masks have become a partisan issue, and I don't really understand why putting a piece of cloth over your face and being forced to do that to protect other people is an encroachment on a person's individuality or their independence. I don't really understand that. And while, I know one of your highest values is independence, is this government encroachment of civil liberties by just asking people to put on a cloth mask to make sure our cases go down?
yeah, it's one of those things where it has to do with personal freedoms, and I think it comes from people who are outside the science community. It's one of those things where too many freedoms is, not good for our own cause. I mean, you look at most people, they, even in college, if you're a non-science major, you're exposed to basic chemistry, basic biology, or sometimes you take like basic earth science or basic physics. So you're not really in, I guess, you're not really put into like the whole entire, ocean of science, where you understand that, hey, we don't have the evidence for it right now, but it's something that science takes a while to prove. There are some things that, cross apply, but, the exact thing that could apply to something else may apply to what's happening right now, but we're
Mhm.
not 100%. We can't claim it does, but we have a strong feeling it does. We just can't back it up, because in the scientific community, it's one of those things where you don't give an absolute until you've either modeled it or you've done something. Because, science is all about proving something. It's prove me wrong. You
Mm.
publish a study and it's trial by fire. Other people should be trying to reproduce that study to figure out, if it's right or wrong. You should get criticism. It's just a gauntlet you run. And so it's one of those things where the gauntlet hasn't been run on that type of stuff. And of course, people see, oh, well, these big institutions have no evidence. And now that evidence is, coming out. It's starting to come out in the journals because there's been time for them to test and figure out what is working. And masks is one of those things that's been proven to work.
I mean, yeah, and especially the N95 masks, which obviously aren't as plentiful as regular cloth and string masks, of course. But I mean, they've been proven to work, just like in nations like Japan, which had a national mask mandate. In that culture of Japan, it's a very collectivist nation, which means people are more for the group than for themselves, if that makes sense. It's not as individualistic as America, where it's like I'm going to do what I want. I want to focus on my individual expression, and I want to focus on my own creativity and see how I can improve myself. While a collectivist nation like Japan is more focused on how can I create harmony, how can I improve society as a whole, how can I be part of the nation's growth. So it's not as selfish as I might say, but it also has its downfalls, of course, such as not having as much business growth as America, or you could say not having as much idealism in artistry and that individualistic expression, promotes. So I think it is down to the culture, but also the education of the citizens, of course, because I mean, you just have to do some quick searches and you see that countries with mass mandates do better than countries without mass mandates. There, it's not like this isn't proven at all. It's not like this is the world's first pandemic. I'm definitely glad this has a lower death rate than previous pandemics, because if it had a higher one, we'd be in trouble. But I mean, we do need to look at American culture and see what are some of the problems of this and why it's become such a partisan issue when it really shouldn't be. And I mean, there's some other partisan issues that should be partisan beyond mask. Like another thing that Biden hopes to do is to reverse Trump's Muslim travel ban on certain nations like Syria and Yemen. And while this happened 4 years ago and has been mostly shut down by the courts, what I really like what Biden is doing here is like reminding us everything Trump did during his presidency and how we forget about it because of the multiple talks of impeachment he's gone through, of every insane tweet he does. Americans can't forget the policies. I mean, another Biden also wants to reverse the tax breaks, and he made sure to emphasize his new tax plan wouldn't have increased taxes for anybody who makes less than $400,000, and he would increase corporate tax to 28%. So I want to know what you think about him increasing corporate tax and sorting typical Democrat Republican switches. Is this really significant for businesses? Do you think that taxes should be raised during a pandemic, or are you always for lesser taxes for businesses? Right now it's at 21% under Trump. So I mean, with your philosophy of of free markets, what do you think about his increased corporate taxes?
Well, I mean, I'll admit, I'm probably not the best person to make the judgment call on this. I
Hmm.
mean, because it's probably upper, economics and so many variables in play. But I mean, I just don't see it as the primary issue right now. You know what I mean? It's like first thing that needs to get done is the pandemic needs to be under control. You know what I mean? It shouldn't be something where it's, worried about tax rates as much as just making sure that you have the pandemic at least contained to an extent, whether that be, handling it in the ways he's planned with a commission that's going to oversee it, like a panel that oversees it and coordinating the states. or whether he changes his mind between now and then. He just needs to get that under control before focusing on the other things.
I mean, how can you get it under control? I mean,
Getting it under control does not mean, a 0% infection rate. It just means that you help curve these numbers. You get these safeguards into play, and you see the numbers start to drop to where it's more. Uh, I hate to say containable because it's kind of like a circular argument there. I'm not really defining what's going on, but just making sure that you're not over capacity, because you see places like Indiana, having a resurgence in case numbers because it's finally hitting the Midwest. And it's
mm,
not the fact that people are getting coronavirus, that just the fact that they get it, that's the problem. I should say, because it's not likely they're going to die as much because it's the vulnerable population. Now that we understand, what's going on, it's the fact that they're taking up a longer stay. And so not only are you talking, the vulnerable population in the hospital, but you're also talking about the vulnerable population that may have to seek hospital services. And if you get above that capacity, you've got to start, triaging, deciding who's worthy of, those hospital beds, or how you're going to allocate those resources. So it's not a matter of, oh, the virus is deadly in its own sense. It's making sure that our health systems are not overwhelmed.
yeah, I know the main reason for most lockdowns in country was to make sure hospitals aren't overwhelmed, but there's also, this what's the word? Theory on how to handle the virus, how to handle a pandemic, which is very focused on revitalizing the economy. And many people have heard of it. It's called herd immunity. Basically, get the maximum amount of people infected with barely any regulation or enforcement, and now get the economy up and running again. I mean, the reason I dislike this herd immunity approach, which I think is really what America seems to be falling with it, with lackadaisical enforcement on coronavirus. It just it's more than, we need to focus more than, hey, the hospitals need to be able to put people in beds with this lung virus. We need to decrease people who get the disease in general. I wish that's what countries would focus on more than your hospitals being overrun. The reason they're being overrun, the reason America hasn't even gone past its first wave yet, is because they're not taking effective legislation to reduce reduce the infection rate. I wish we would look beyond hospital beds. They're becoming too crowded. That's not the main issue here. And people always focus on the death rate of COVID, but in all honesty, this disease also inflicts permanent lung damage, and it weakens your immune system for a time. So while it doesn't kill people, it still leaves very averse health effects that we need to focus on. It seems like everybody's like, oh, it's only 3.7% to 4% death rate. We don't need to worry about it. But still, you should, just like any disease. It's like, I mean, it's like saying, you have benign cancer, don't worry about it. Yes, you should worry about it. It's still harmful to your body. There's no reason that we should be treating this with just this nonchalantness.
Well, I don't think it's the acute effects are really the problem, because you will
Mm.
have those smaller things that happen, as you mentioned, like permanent lung damage. You will have things like that happen that are more rare complications. I just think it's the fact of getting people to understand that this is a different era, and this may even be a more difficult thing to contain than influenzas, because you have mutations where people can catch it twice in such a you know
Yeah, it's been
lower
very
amount of
rare.
time. You look at the flu; it's a flu shot every year essentially, because change in the strain. You get the flu shot, you become immune to next year's flu, which is why it's so important. Well, if you have people getting COVID twice in less than a year, that's obviously a problem, because immunity is not as long as people think. It's not like a well, the either immunity is not as long as people think, or the virus is mutating so fast that your body's not immune. I guess it's one and the same thing, but it's one of those things where this may be one of those things where you have these measures in place for a longer period of time,
Mhm.
where you may have these gatherings after you have the immunity and everything, after you have the vaccines that come out, but you may have masks whenever you go to games. You may have all that type of stuff. Now, hopefully, the gatherings won't be as limited, and people seem to have, disregarded those. But I mean, this could be something of the future. So it's just one of those uncertainties and one of those things where I think it's going to be a hard pill for our culture to swallow because we're not used to masking up. You look at Korea in particular, for example, they have a pandemic that comes around. They're not afraid to throw masks on. Taiwan's not afraid to throw masks on. They're not afraid to be tracked by the government because they see it as, hey, we surrender these rights. We understand that it's a benefit to the people. It's not
Mhm.
something that's Orwellian or this 1984 big government. So,
It's yeah. I mean, the question is if it's authoritarian enough to even call it Orwellian, because that's just for the administration to maintain its power. It introduces authoritarian legislation. It's not even for the betterment of the people; it's for the betterment of the elite. While this pandemic legislation, I would say it's for the majority of people. But what's something that that Biden is changing that you believe is an overall good thing and was, you know, not a great decision on Trump's part to do during his presidency? Was there any specific policy that you disliked Trump did
uh,
specifically that Biden's claimed he's going to reverse?
I mean, I guess there's not, I mean, too much I'd be controversial over by the looks of the switches. One of them that kind of comes to mind is the whole Mexico City policy, which is where they're going to allow people to donate to, if I recall correctly, they allow individuals to donate to charities that endorse abortion, if I recall correctly. But that is something that flips back and forth between presidencies, and the only reason why I would endorse something like that is because if somebody's going to donate money to a cause that is official, and of course this comes with definitions, which I'll spill out here in a second, then they should have the right to do so. You know what I mean? If somebody can donate to NRA, you know, trying to defend their, right to own firearms or whatever they feel is being approached in, possibly encroached upon, I mean, then somebody should have the right to be able to support what they believe in as long as it's, well, I can't say harming someone else because it depends on the various definitions, but they should be able to put their money towards that cause.
Yeah, the Mexico City policy is basically the federal government refusing to fund non-governmental organizations using nonprofits, that provide abortion counseling, um, or abortion referrals. It's basically a federal government not funding organizations that would possibly encourage abortions in some people's situations. That's the general gist of what it is. And I mean, when you do discuss abortion, it's all about where you think life starts, and that's very philosophical, of course. I mean, this may be different from most, but I've said it before in this podcast. I dislike the two camps of pro-life and pro-choice. It's too much of a simplistic view to look at when you're thinking about ending a person's life, ending a fetus's life. You know, no matter how you look at it, if you look at the eventuality of this sperm becoming an individual, a human individual, then you need to just stop looking at the present moment, look at what's going to happen in the future. And in all honesty, I kind of support the government backing away from abortion. Now, you made the relation to the NRA and taking away gun rights. The only reason gun rights are still such a controversial issue in America because of the Second Amendment. And it's funny because the Second Amendment was literally made so civilians could basically cause a revolution against an authoritarian government. It wasn't made for the uses of terrorist groups causing huge homicides in clubs like in Orlando, or the multiple shooting up of churches that has been done pretty much every year in the 2000s. So, I mean, the people don't realize the purpose of the Second Amendment was not for mass shootings. The founders could never predict that we would have these assault rifles that could kill 30 people with 30 bullets in one clip. It was just beyond their scope of imagination. And you can't expect a law to hold up after 200 years without any change. That's the only reason I think guns are just the gun lobby is just so powerful in the US, while abortion is not protected by the Constitution. So I don't really know if that comparison is apt, you know. I mean, I wouldn't make the comparison. They're two different things.
Yeah,
And
and
go
I know
ahead.
that they're like two different things, but it's, just the fact that if somebody is allowed to have that freedom because, whenever it comes to resources, whenever you receive money, that becomes your money in a sense, unless it's earmarked for something. If
Mhm,
the government gives me money as a stipend for my housing, of course, or I get a scholarship for school, then that's earmarked towards something else. But if I receive money and it is my money, don't you have the right to do that if you're not causing harm upon another person directly? And of
well,
course, that comes with the harm thing and definition of life and everything. But you could say, okay, by upholding gun rights, you're upholding someone's right to purchase a firearm where they may murder someone. So
mhm.
it's like one of those things where it depends on how direct you see it and everything. But essentially, what I mean by that is, as long as you're not funding a terrorist group that's going to go, rampant and kill someone or shoot stuff up, or you're not funding like the drug trade or something, then what are you worried about? You put your
I
money
mean,
towards that.
if your taxes are going to the U.S. government, then you're funding some type of terrorist group. I mean, this is the U.S. policy towards the Middle East is to fund militia groups that were typically against the government, and then, oh, big surprise, the militia groups turns against America because they're supporting Israel. So I mean, it's I would go against the black and white here of if you're not killing somebody, then do whatever you want with your money. It's like
Well,
saying don't ban any drugs, don't ban people from buying drugs just because it doesn't cause harm to other people. These people are
I'm not going as that far. What I'm saying is with your
Mhm,
money, giving it to charities, as long as you're not causing someone something like that, because you can take anything like that out of context. You could say, okay, by putting your money towards a candidate, you are endorsing things because once they get into power, they may, pursue a war or military action. Of course, that's all debatable on how you want to look at it because you look at war, you can say, oh yeah, you're funding invasions in the Middle East, but take it from another perspective. What if you're toppling a regime that was oppressing a certain populace? I mean, there's millions of lenses you can view things through for war as much as abortion and as much as the NRA and other things like that. So it's kind of one of those sticky situations where it's easy to write off, as I said before. But my original point is essentially if you have money and you want to give it to a cause that's not directly causing harm, in a sense. I guess once again, that's going to open up the whole
yeah, yeah,
debate.
yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
you get where I'm going. You
I
get,
get where you're going. I get where you're
yeah.
going. I mean,
That's
for
as long as that's not your intent, you're fine. Okay, I
mm,
don't see why it has to be such a big issue. You know what I mean? Because you're doing something with the money. At least it's circulating. At least you're not, just putting it into the ground. Because you could do many things with money. You could just put it in a shoebox and put it underground. But at
yeah,
least you're
yeah, yeah,
doing
yeah.
it to benefit someone else. So
Mhm. I mean, definitely intentions. If only I can see into people's minds, read their intentions, I would understand people a lot more. But I do want to make that the end of this episode. I think we had talked about a lot of things here, so that was a good conversation. This is us signing out.
yep.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.